Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to the Voice of Reason podcast / the Benjamin A. Boyce YouTube channel. Today's guest, as a part of my ongoing series on gender, sexuality, and transition, is in fact a biologist who teaches somewhere in the Midwest. She was actually a biologist or biology professor at the Evergreen State College and moved on to other pastures. I don't know if they're technically greener pastures because, again, that's the Pacific Northwest that she left, and now she's somewhere in the Midwest, which I think is more just tundrific rather than forestated like we are here. Anyhow, the content of this discussion is about the biology of gender. Now, gender meaning sex in this specific discussion, and the effects of testosterone on the development of an entity. Robin works with mice, but we talk about the similarities between what happens with mice and their development and what happens with humans. Now, this discussion is a bit apropos of the current kind of controversy or the discussion around the Olympics and around sports and around who qualifies or should qualify as a female. This particular discussion isn't really that political. This is more just informative. So you are free to take your own conclusions or argue with the points as they suit or don't suit your own research and experience and so on. That all said, here is Robin Forbes-Lorman.
Hello.
What's your official title? You're just a biologist. Are you an evolutionary biologist?
No.
Okay.
I am a biologist, assistant professor at Ripon College, and my specialty, I would say, is behavioral neuroendocrinology.
Okay.
And I teach anatomy and physiology here.
And you do research too, right?
Yeah.
With little micey
sex
things?
differences in rats. So using a rat model, looking at hormones and development. That's the behavioral neuroendocrinology, so the brain and hormones, how hormones relate to the brain and behavior. Okay. And then I study a model of sex differences in the brain.
Okay. And in what way does your research on mice potentially map onto rats onto the humanoid?
So we study, a lot of the brain regions in rats are comparable enough that we can look at the role of certain brain regions and developmental processes, that how hormones affect them, certain gene expression, but then relate to how the brain is organized. And of course, there's differences between rats and humans, but it's like any basic research, it tells us a piece of the story that can tell us about brain development, models for for certain disorders such as social behaviors, depression-like behaviors that are not perfect correlates, but we can look at behaviors in rodents that are of interest to certain disorders in humans.
Okay. And the whole sex topic is pretty, well, I guess it's an anciently incendiary topic.
I suppose so. Yeah.
Goes back quite a ways, right?
Right. And then there's been differences so on one hand, there's a push to look at more sex differences in terms of a lot of the research we've done in physiology, for example, and in the medical field has focused on males. So then there's been cases where we're either overdosing females or giving them a drug. So actually Zolpidem, Ambien is a big one that turns out we were overdosing females on this drug for years because it was studied in males, right? So the doses, how it's metabolized, liver enzymes, how the liver functions is all studied in males. Of course, one thing's just a weight difference. But even besides that, there's physiological processes that are different in females that weren't studied. So on one hand, there's a push to study females as a subset of humans that need to be looked at. On the other hand, there's a lot of controversy around it in terms of, well, when are the differences? When aren't there? When do they matter? And when you get to the behavior and cognitive aspect, right, that's where you get to the whole Google memo thing of when do the differences matter and when don't they, and how do we interpret some of that data?
And then how do we act on that? I guess interpret and then act on that. Right.
What do we do about that? So definitely the difference in medicine versus kind of the behavior, people see it differently. To me, I'm a biologist, right? So I see differences as biology. And then, of course, what we do about that biology, how we act on it, is partially sometimes outside of my field, but also it's nuanced, right? And
and it's
is not
culturally
necessarily
informed.
right.
Yeah. So have you been affected, or have you any thoughts or considered about it seems like a certain sort of gender ideology is trying to reinterpret science, or at least try to abolish our idea of sex. At least in like Nature, I believe, is pushing. The magazine Nature has published
Okay.
a couple articles that are trying to abolish the idea that there is any sex difference. And it seems like that is informed not by science itself, but more of a gender theory. Have you seen that taking place at all, or are you pretty just focusing on the data? And
I'm mostly focused on the data myself. I taught a course this semester on the biology of sex and gender differences. So we approached it from a biological standpoint, but we considered, right, what is sex, what's gender, and why are we looking at when does sex, first of all, the profit mechanisms, right? So sex differences, there is a whole lot of biology we understand, a really cool biology about how males and females differentiate, and then how that also can sometimes is not always as clear cut, and there's these differences of sexual development that are coming up in sports right now, right?
yeah,
But then, and I mostly stuck with it. We did get a little bit into thinking about, okay, when does this matter for when doesn't this matter too? So, and how do we decide, right? So looking at some of the meta-analyses on cognition and when, so I guess I haven't been personally affected by, I still stick with, okay, this is the biology, we're going to look at it. These are differences. What we decide to do about that is someone else's decision. And I don't think I've seen those Nature articles that you're referring to.
well,
What is the argument?
A evolutionary biologist named Colin Wright on Twitter rebuts them pretty thoroughly. And also, I believe last week, the New York Times also ran an op-ed that was pushing the narrative that sex doesn't really matter, or sex is socially constructed. And specifically, if I'm recalling correctly, Colin is taking down a univariate analysis of sex differences to say that there's no one single way that the sexes are differentiated, because there's always a variable within any given one level of analysis. But if you look at multivariate analysis of sex differences, there's pretty strong corollary difference between males and females if you look at different levels at one time.
And he's using the term sex, not gender.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. And did you study, or have you considered, I believe you contacted me while you were running last quarter's or semester's course about this topic. You investigated a little bit about the trans issue, or I guess the trans research.
So when we got to the brain, and I studied the brain. So in the course we went through, sexual differentiation of the genitals, and that happens early in development, and then brain differentiation happens after that. And of course, it's more complicated because brains are complicated. But when we got there, we touched upon the biological basis of transgenderism. So, and what we know about it, it's really hard to study. The hard thing is, in an animal model, there is no gender. So first, one thing important is to define what I mean by sex and gender, maybe, right? Okay. So sex is biological sex, which itself is not simple. We spent most of the semester, now you got me thinking quarters, we're semesters here, most of the semester talking about just what is biological sex, and that itself being a complicated process with multiple steps where there can be differences in sexual development. And then we got to a little bit of the brain, which is when I started to talk about gender, because gender can also involve a self-identification piece. So to me, there's a big debate about whether is gender a social construct. And I personally, I define it as yes, because it's something that it's a term that humans have come up with. Right. So other species don't have gender. they have biological sex. So gender is something that applies. So I'm studying rats, I'm studying non-human primates, I'm studying whatever species, I'm talking about sex differences. In humans, I'm talking about sex differences too, most of the time, if I'm talking about biology. But people do study gender differences in cognition, for example. And to me, that would be a gender difference because we're looking at well, it really depends on how you get your data. You're asking these people to self-identify their gender. And 99% of the time, it's going to be the same as their biological sex. So the transgender issues came up when we talked about, what is the biology we know about transgender individuals being a very difficult thing to study because we have no rodent model, right? We can't ask rats what their gender is. And that's why I use the term sex. So we touched a little bit upon the biology that we do know and how we study it, and mostly in terms of the biology of what we know about the brain, opposed to in terms of persistence and desistance in those categories.
So when studying the cognitive development and then studying how the sex influences cognition or the development of cognition, is there like a kind of a step up into the realm of gender? Like the more social an animal is, the more complex the brain is, and that gives rise. Is gender built upon sex?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. So how I actually have drawn out a little flow chart for myself before, and we did it in class as well. So going from, well, first of all the steps involved in sexual differentiation to create our biology, but then the brain being more of actually mosaic in terms of you could have different parts of the brain doing slightly different things. And then I see gender as another like layer on top of that has a social influence in terms of how do I see myself as a biological female fitting in to society as a female. But to me, that's kind of built on top, another layer on top, that is, again, most of the time associated with your biological sex. And there's a place there for what I see as a deviation from that layer that already happened, where people can, and some of that, sometimes that's because of the intersex, right? There's all kinds of crossover from biological female to biological male that can occur. And sometimes that can be associated with gender identity as well. But sometimes we don't have, it's really just at the level of the brain, and gender identity, I think, being something that humans as highly socially evolved and highly cognitively, how we fit into the world, right? That's something that we have that other species, I don't think, right, have. And that gets a little beyond my area of expertise in terms of that. We're getting into, gender identity and how we fit into the world, psychological piece there as well.
But at the same time, are you confident in your understanding, or do you have some understanding of how being female affects one's cognition and how being a male affects one's cognition, or at least behavior?
That's kind of a big question. Do you mean any specific behaviors, or just that it does? You mean how that
it does, I guess. Like, right. Just to... okay, we both were at Evergreen for a period of time, and one of the truisms at Evergreen that I heard would pop up kind of out of nowhere is that gender is a social construct, and that everybody knows that gender is a social construct. I had a history professor just say that in the middle of a lecture, like, fact, gender is a social construct, fact. And I never really saw how that was broken down. I kind of understand now that there's a political implication to saying that gender is a social construct, but I still think that in order to say that, we need to kind of really grapple with how is sex informing our gender? How is biology backing up my behaviors or kind of pushing me in a certain pattern of behavior?
And that's again, how I see it is I would agree that gender is a social construct, but that's in terms of the language, right? That's a term we use. It's a social, this level of gender identity that other species don't have. But I would also argue that our gender is 99% informed by our biology, right? That's what is, and of course, individual variability and brains are complex, and we've got a whole nother layer there. But most of the time, right, your biological sex is what is influencing and determining your gender. That doesn't mean it always does. And there are biological bases of brain differences we found in individuals who are transgender. There's some biological theories about why this happens in terms of developmental mismatch in between when your genitals develop and your brain develops, and that the brain is more of a mosaic of masculine and feminine traits.
Okay.
But again, the biggest thing that determines males and females, we haven't gone through this yet, but the biggest thing is just testosterone during, especially during early development. And it's a huge difference, right? That males have this testosterone acting in the brain and females don't. There's actually some theories, though, it's really interesting to show that there's biological bases for actually decreasing sex differences. So we've got this huge effect of testosterone. There's some data that there's other factors that act to reduce that, so that there's actually evolution mechanisms to reduce sex differences in behavior that would be even greater because of this huge biological difference we have in testosterone.
What do you mean by that? That the social climate in which a child is being developed in the womb might inform how that testosterone or the brain is interacting with the testosterone?
Yeah, and again, I studying is with rodents that how that plays in humans is definitely more complex. So we've got parents who are deliberately doing things, not for better, but
so like you say, you subject a mother to stress while she's gestating the mice, and then you look at the effect of behavior afterwards. Is that
right? And that could affect males and females differently, right? Is one thing. There's some evidence, like, for example, in rodents, that maternal care the mother takes care of the pups, that they do so slightly differently in mothers, male and female pups, and that's actually acts to reduce sex differences that exist already. Right. So, I mean, the point is that there are huge biological sex differences, right? And there's evolutionary reason for that, for those, in terms of this testosterone that is present in early life is important for development of the male genitalia. There's some evidence that there might be some mechanisms that act in the brain to actually kind of counteract that. The differences in the brain, it's not saying they don't exist. It's not saying that they do but that there's other ways that because that influence on genitals has to be so big, there's other mechanisms that help to reduce that.
Yeah, on the brain.
It's kind of interesting, right? That not all sex differences mean, well, first of all, that we're saying anything's better or worse, right? Yeah. I'm studying males and females. I'm not saying that males or females are worse or better in this way just because they're different. And then some differences also differences in biology might not always correspond to differences in behavior, I guess.
Yeah, which could have to do with upbringing or the state of the mother during gestation. There's all these other inputs that are going on in the organism as it develops.
Right. It may be actually important evolutionarily as well, some of those.
Do you have an idea of when testosterone was started to be used by biology as a mechanism or as something in order to differentiate the sexes? Do you know, like, when in the development or the evolutionary development of creatures?
Interesting question. So to get at that, I would say we have to get at evolution of the testes, right? So the testes are what produce testosterone. Testes are due to this SRY gene in humans. So the SRY gene is in most mammals the testes determining factor. So it's a gene that, and I'm not sure how long this is. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but the mammalian sexual differentiation is different than other species. So long ago there was autosomes. So most of our chromosomes are autosomal chromosomes. They're not sex chromosomes. We have 23 chromosomes, and a long time ago we didn't have sex chromosomes. Right. This is an ancient ancestor of ours, and the
but
sex
still mammalian ancestor. Do you think?
Yeah,
Okay.
because like birds have a different mechanism of sexual differentiation. So there's birds have male and female. They have completely different chromosomes that do it. They have an X and a W, which I know nothing about.
Yeah.
Besides that, we have X and Y. Birds have Z and W, which is just a completely different way of doing it. Um, and this Y chromosome that males have actually evolved, we would think, from the X. So over time, this chromosome evolved and somehow acquired this testes determining factor, this protein that then initiates this cascade to create testes. Somehow that was beneficial. And the benefit of having two sexes is, increased genetic diversity. How that evolved over time is definitely beyond what it's been studied, right? Of how the Y chromosome's history, evolutionary history, is a whole area of study.
Yeah.
But a big reason the testes matter is they make testosterone. Not the only reason, but a big reason. And that's where it gets into so testosterone levels at different time points. The testes are developmentally, produce testosterone at different time points. Some of those time points are now known to be important for internal genitalia to develop, external. There's a separate time period we know where brain differentiation occurs. And that's getting back to that developmental mismatch hypothesis that the time point for when genitalia and the brain are masculinized is one word that's used, right? Are different time points. And then you have puberty as well as another time point where you have this surge in testosterone that seems to be important for male development.
And is the testes develop, or the genitals go in the direction of male and female before the brain does?
Right.
Okay. And
Right.
the genitals go and then the brain,
right,
based on what's happening down below.
Based on what's happening down below, right. But it's interesting. It's different. So testosterone is a hormone, right? It's broken down. It has metabolites that act as well on different receptors. So the process by which the brain is organized is a little different. It's different metabolites that act on different receptors, and a different time point as well.
And
with different,
females still produce testosterone.
So females have testosterone, some from the adrenal glands, as do males, small amounts, and that's the main source. There also can be low levels in conditions like polycystic ovarian syndrome. It gets, but much lower levels. So males are much more variable. Their male range can range from quite a wide range, and females tend to be under 5 nanomoles per liter, which is that key number in the current Olympic requirements.
Okay.
Unless there's something else going on, which could be, a tumor, as well as testes. There are females with testes as well.
So if going into that sports discussion, it seems like it's politically fraught because, again, people have this notion of gender and sex. And there's when we're speaking about sports, we're speaking about physical performance. We're not speaking about cultural or identity or anything else.
The word gender should not be used, I don't think, when talking about, gender testing, gender verification. That makes no sense.
Okay.
To me, it makes sense to talk about there has biological categories of male and female that we have decided are important, right? To keep females be able to be competitive. And some people might not think that's important, but that's the first question is, do you think that there should be a separate women's category? A lot of people do say yes. And then that's a biological category, right? And how we the history of how we've decided that has been really interesting, right? It used to be, do you have a Y chromosome? If so, you're a male. And then we realized, this is not working. We have females here who have a Y chromosome, but they're females, biological females, right? So I don't mean gender identity. I don't mean they're transgender. They're not transgender. There was actually a Fox report that said Castor Semenya is a transgender. They later apologized, I guess.
Okay.
So did realize that that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about someone we're deciding whether she is female or male, right? That's a biological, and it's a hard question, harder than you think. For
Yeah.
something that is primarily, and 99% of the time is binary.
Yeah. So and I guess that's where the controversy comes, and not just controversy, but the interest factor of a story
Mhm.
like this. The margins are what's the most interesting to us. Something that is the exception is the
Right.
most interesting to us. Like I don't want to mispronounce her name, but the runner, the
Castor
South
Semenya, I
Semenya.
believe. Semenya.
So I was just reading some articles about her, and one said that she is XY, but it linked to another article, and it didn't seem to tell me enough about it. But
Right. I believe that her medical records have not been released.
mhm.
There's a lot of theory about what she is, which on one hand feels kind of weird to me to be talking
Yeah,
about this individuals and what she might be. On the other hand, I like to believe that the more we understand the biology, that the more fair we can ultimately be. And the
hmm.
extreme case of not understanding her biology is to call her a transgender individual, right? That's wrong. So to me, that it makes sense to me to. And at one point, I know she was going. There was maybe some test leaks. She was going to share more results than now she is. I'm not sure.
Hmm.
But there's definitely um, some that I believe is at least accepted to be known about her biology in terms of
Yeah, yeah. But then there's that case which there's enough ambiguity to say that she always identified and thought she was female from
mhm,
the get go, and rose up through the ranks. And then there's other cases of transgender, males who were males went through male puberty and then identified as the other sex. Like there was some track stuff that happened, I believe, in North Carolina, where two trans women just completely blew away all the females in the category.
mhm.
I think it was a sprint of some sort, and that's a whole other controversy, right?
Right. So these are individuals who have either surgically transitioned or lowered testosterone levels. I think it's the current
Yeah.
requirement is that if you're going from male to female transition and trying to compete, that there's a testosterone level, which is not going to change. But so the question is, what is the impact of hormones up to that point and through development, through puberty? Do those matter too? That's quite a question I think you're getting
Yeah.
at. It's a different question than circulating. So there's circulating testosterone, which is Castor Semenya's um, question, right? Is what levels matter that are circulating versus levels that you've been brought up with, which actually do apply to Castor Semenya as well, right? She did have whatever testosterone she has now, she's had throughout development as well.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but there are different time points and that's where my research does look at a bit is what's the role of, for example, testosterone. I don't look at athletics for um, my own research in rats. That'd be really interesting, though. But what is the impact of testosterone at different time points, and then how is that different than circulating levels? Um,
So what are some of those impacts then? Just to be clear, it's probably pretty obvious, but
so the circulating levels, right? That's the biggest one that's been, and there's actually another female transgender athlete, Joanna Harper, who is so she's a male to female transgender individual who I believe is a runner, and she is a physiologist, I believe. So she's studying some of these impacts, and her argument is that circulating testosterone is what matters the most, right? So on muscle mass, and performance.
and so by circulating testosterone, that means to say that the body produces this. It's not injected, as opposed to.
And I also mean that it's present at that time. So the other word for it is activating. So it is in someone who has testes that are active. So you post puberty, especially, you've got circulating throughout your body the effects of that testosterone. If you were to go through a surgical transition or take drugs to lower testosterone, you no longer have those same levels, right? Versus there are certain conditions. We talked
Mm.
about female testosterone before. There's a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, CAH, in females that results in high levels of testosterone early in development. So that testosterone during the time point either of genital differentiation or brain differentiation, so early life, can have different effects on the body that's lasting because it's during the developmental time point.
Like what effects? Like not necessarily hairier or more
Right,
stout,
not
or
that.
but
So
more cognitive,
secondary.
or
Right. So it would be much more subtle, and we don't, in terms of impacts of hormones during. So this would be in your utero and early after birth. The impact of that testosterone on athletic performance, I don't believe we know anything about. I would be surprised if there were big effects, because at that point, that testosterone is primarily acting to literally create internal male structures, external male structures, as well as brain typical male sex behavior. There's some other behaviors that tend to be different in male and females that are organized during that time.
Would you are we talking about something that like object oriented versus people oriented, that kind of thing? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, and again, my work is either mostly in rodents, or we have the work in females with the CAH, so those females who do have high levels of testosterone. That's kind of the one way we study it in humans, right? We don't inject testosterone into humans during early life, but we do have those models, right? So individuals with CAH, those females, I do believe there's some data about their play behavior, for example, so social play behavior and ways they play and things they play with. Play behavior is one of those that's somewhat controversial, right, in terms of sex differences in rough and tumble play has been found. It's very context dependent. Sometimes males have been found to play more than females, both in rodents, primates, non-human, and human, but it does seem to be very social. There's some social aspects to that as well. So context dependent. There's definitely parental influence on that in terms of toy preference. But there is some data with these females with CAH, and the biggest one is actually homosexuality. That about 30% of these females are tend to be homosexual. So there's that is one piece of evidence to the role of testosterone influencing the brain and behavior during early life.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't think there's much data we have. Puberty, then, that's when these secondary sex characteristics, so hair, body mass, skeletal muscle size, voice deepening, that's the time when those are starting to develop. So testosterone during puberty, with males have higher levels then as well. That would be when I think the question of, is there an advantage to going through puberty as a male? Does the advantage of that last into athletic performance into adulthood, or beyond puberty? And that I don't believe we have good data on either, but that would be I think that's the concern of a secondary concern besides the levels that are circulating. So let's say you go through puberty as a biological male, you have testes, you have high levels of testosterone throughout puberty, you develop differently than you would if you didn't have that testosterone. And then you decide to transition. So you decide you're a female and you transition to a female. Maybe that's surgically, maybe that's lowering testosterone levels. So the question is, if you do lower those levels, was there still an advantage of you going through puberty as a male? And I think there's not much evidence to say that there is. At this point, the requirements, the IAAF does allow. It's all about that circulating level. So as long as you change that, and that's what's consistent with what we're asking, what they're now asking for Caster Semenya is to lower that level of her circulating testosterone to be in the female range.
So are you saying that we don't really have data one way or the other if it's circulating testosterone that gives you the performative edge versus the way in which your body developed before this moment that you're in?
I think we don't have good data on either. So the whole, I don't know if you've read much about the paper that this whole Caster Semenya is the one who's being influenced by this most publicly, at least, right? There are other individuals, other athletes that are going to be impacted by the ruling. But the study there's a lot of controversy behind the study that looked at they were looking at the role of testosterone in athletics and trying to correlate. So what they took a bunch of individuals and divide them into tertiles, which is a great word. So
what does it mean exactly?
So tertiles would be instead of quartiles 4, it's 3 groups.
Okay.
The 3 different, so high, medium, and low testosterone. and then looking at the athletic performance in those three groups. And I haven't read the details on this. I know that there are concerns about the data, that like missing individuals, the data analysis they did, and there's been actually a call for the retraction of that paper.
Yeah.
This is the paper that determined that 5 nanomole criteria. So there's some evidence that testosterone is advantageous for athletic performance. I personally
circulating testosterone.
I think that needs to be refined and redone, and despite the science behind it is right now that if there's this much questioning of the data, that's not a good sign.
Okay. But what do you think you would be able to say about what does circulating testosterone do for somebody in a competitive environment? Like, what does that activate? Like, I guess the frame of mind, like the desire to dominate. Like, what is it?
Right. Well, and probably, it's a good point. Probably more than one thing. There probably is, testosterone and aggression, so potentially competitive edge. But there's definitely something. I think the idea is there's something physical there as well with.
Okay. Okay.
Muscle mass, for example.
Okay. Which can go away once one is off testosterone. Like it pretty. It's more fluid.
Right. And that's and so the question of this is how do we decide who's male and who's female? And it's 99% of the time it's pretty clear cut, and it's probably never going to be perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
The role of those hormones during puberty, I don't know if we're ever going to be able to figure that out, but we have to decide what criteria, have some criteria that we're going to use.
Yeah.
And to me, it does make most sense to, the circulating testosterone. So what the current levels are, that makes some sense to me, especially from where we've come from in terms of looking at the Y chromosome or the SRY gene. Those don't make any sense to me because we have a lot of cases where we know that doesn't work.
Okay.
We've got females with testes, or females with the SRY gene where they're still biologically female, and that's pretty fairly clear cut. The thing that's makes me say I don't know if we're ever gonna have 100% great divide is, so Caster Semenya is a really interesting case because she probably doesn't have functioning receptors for testosterone. So you have testosterone, and then you have to be able to have these proteins that detect it and allow your body to respond to it. And there's several cases of individuals it's called androgen insensitivity syndrome, where you're not sensitive to androgens. And there's plenty of cases where females can be female. Like they would never know this was a case until they didn't go through puberty, or didn't start menstruating. And it's likely, again, it seems strange to talk about her biology when we don't know it, that Caster Semenya has a partially functional receptor.
Okay.
So that it's functioning a bit, and she just have slightly more masculine characteristics than other people with this same genetic condition. But we don't know her genetic condition either. But that she is biologically female. It's a really gray area, right? And again, we don't know for sure, but I think we pretty much know she has testes. That's pretty high levels of testosterone, but there's differences in the receptor, and there can be all different kinds of mutations in the receptor that could result in zero functionality to some, all the way up to actually you could have the same condition and have someone be phenotypically a male. I don't think that's as common, but
it seems like it's much easier to study or observe competitive edge of like in a I guess stereotypical masculine competitive environment or something where something needs to happen right now. But is there a feminine or a female competitive edge where certain females are better at other behaviors? They have an edge at, and I guess you study mice, so within that framework or in those situations, what makes a good female or somebody who's like a cutting edge female biology, like better at raising children, better at social interaction?
Right, because with
is that studyable?
Yeah, so with rats, right, things you'd look at in rat behavior would be maternal behavior. And rats are different than humans in that, right, there is the male does not participate in
Okay.
parental behavior, right? So that's one difference there. There would be male aggression at certain times, right? Really, and that could be related to when the male mated. So in the lab, that's a little artificial, right? But
Wait, just for a moment, are you saying that the way in the moment in which the male reproduces, or I guess inseminates the female, like the state of his physiology informs his children, like in that moment? Like, were you saying something about aggression, how aggressive the father is?
Yeah, I was saying that there is, so the male rats don't participate in paternal care, but there are, increased levels of like a way to get a male rat to be aggressive would be pair him with a female and then have an intruder come, right? But I guess that's more of a mating related behavior than
Okay.
once the offspring are there, we don't want those males in that cage anymore. They're
Because they
probably
will
going to
kill.
eat them. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Um,
And is
yeah.
that because they're hungry or because they're jealous, you think?
Good question. Probably not because they're hungry, right? They get plenty of food. That's a good question in terms of just not in their biology to and I don't know about rates, right? In terms of like I know it's happened in the lab. Typically we don't let it happen because we don't have the male in there. And in the wild the female is going to go off by herself anyways.
Okay.
So I don't know much about and how common it is versus just kind of like a side effect of being in a tight quarters in a lab cage if you're which again is not we don't study that specifically, but so
I might have framed it wrong, but I'm just trying to like understand. We have a lot of discussions in our society about the at least in sports, it's like how masculine you are, or how much testosterone you are is just going to make you more of a competitive edge, right? So we're looking at the male rubric of winning, or we're looking at a specific way of measuring what the biology is doing. I'm just wondering, is there another way of measuring biology that would orient it towards like a more female, like
probably. So similar to in the medical field, females being understudied in terms of drug responses, and that being a downside for understanding female biology. Even in the rodent world, females are understudied because of their circulating hormones. So again, circulating hormones. In females, what that means is estrous cycle, right? So females have this cycling of estrogen and progesterone. And in rats, it's every 4 to 5 days that they're cycling through their cycle. So
that's
a lot of
cramps.
Researchers don't want to study that, right? It's a pain. Like you don't want to either you have to know where they are in their cycle or manipulate it, or so. Not to say that there aren't researchers who study females specifically. And I'm actually planning to do a study in the fall that's looking at. Actually, I'm going to be looking at cognitive behavior across the estrous cycle. So I'll be looking at changes in cognition across the estrous cycle. Because it's not studied very much. Because again, testosterone's easier to manipulate. It's males. I mean, their levels probably do vary, but we kind of ignore it. It was like, okay, males have testosterone, easy to study. In my work, sometimes we even give low levels of testosterone to females in order to just kind of give them, make them simpler, right? So the female biology, even in rats, I think is understudied.
You're saying that no matter what, the female is a mystery and a riddle that everybody's.
Yes. Yeah.
But so because of the cycle of the female, that makes the female much more complex of an organism to really understand, because there's always this variability.
That probably in reality does exist more in males than we like to believe.
Yeah.
But yes, we do. I often say that to my students. I'm like, yeah, females are more complex. And when you teach, when I teach puberty in females, it takes a lot more work for students to learn females because of that menstrual cycle, which is actually a really cool example of biology.
And you're speaking about mammals or just rats or humans too?
Not just rats, humans as well.
Okay.
Right. So like sperm production in males is pretty simple.
Okay. It's just
females,
like on.
Right. And it's constant. And then, I mean, it's still complex, biology in general is pretty complex, but compared to the female menstrual cycle.
Hmm.
But, and part of the reason maybe we say females are more complex is also because they're understudied. So when we understand something,
Yeah.
we understand the menstrual cycle pretty well. But, I know there's still research who, debate whether female mood differs throughout the menstrual cycle. Now it's called premenstrual dysphoric disorder. Like
Okay.
used to be PMS, right?
Oh.
So still, and of course that's probably very variable amongst different females, right? How they experience that. But
what's some of the I guess we have to wrap this up pretty soon. You got to go, but you brought up something about like the female development. Like you said, it was really fascinating and interesting. Could you just? It seems like some of the topics that I'm covering have to do with the one thing that I'm trying to study or give interviews about is rapid onset gender dysphoria, which seems to be affecting females specifically. And there's research to show that females within a certain age range are very susceptible to a social contagion, or they manifest a similar way of processing despair or like psychological discomfort. They'll all converge on the same problem, such as anorexia. Like that was a very not fashionable. I don't mean that in a slanderous way, but it seems that there's something about the female development that makes them very susceptible to a kind of a group behavior. I'm wondering if you've seen that or studied that, or what's going on in the female when she's going through puberty that is much more complex or has a different social implication than what the male is going through.
It's a really interesting question. My first answer is I'm not sure. But in terms of stuff, right? So I guess one thing is maybe potentially one difference, right? Is with female is kind of it's not really this way, but it's the default system.
Okay.
And that's why there's a lot of ways to default back to being female. So if there's a mutation in the androgen receptor, that's going to be phenotypically female. And I was wondering if, and that testosterone in male is constantly, so these surges of testosterone I talked about before during early life that are acting to masculinize that system. And I was wondering if there's something maybe unique with that hormones in females in puberty kind of being the first time that there's really high levels of, in that case, estrogen and progesterone are being experienced, that maybe there's something with that being the system. But other than that, I'm not sure about the difference between the social influence on females versus males and how you'd study that in rats.
You said that there's certain brain structures that develop, and then you just said that females kind of the default in the womb and utero, like cognitive development. How does do we understand like how the female cognition develops as opposed to the male?
I'd say no.
Okay.
Just because that male and female cognition is a thing, that would be something that's huge overlap, right? And
yeah,
there's not at that level of the brain that there's not there's sex differences in certain behaviors. At the cognitive level, I would not say there's a female way of being, of thinking, right? That's overstated in terms of the, right?
Yeah. Which would get into gender and how females are expected and males are expected to act, which would then filter their behavior after the fact.
Right. And then in terms of like cognitive differences in rats, for example, are not huge, right? There's differences in, aggression or, and a large of that circulating testosterone, again, that's a big part of that aggressive behavior. But that, it's not like, and of course, rats, we can't study all the different cognitive processes in rats, but
how do you study the cognition of rats? Do you give them little math problems or?
There's different tests. Either there's object recognition and various cognitive tasks that we can do for rats. I mean, learning and memory
Oh, okay.
type of tasks that would, definitely not math.
Yeah.
So in terms of some of the things that we find, so one of the bigger gender differences, and I'm saying gender because that's typically how it's talked about, is like mental rotation in humans, like rotating a three-dimensional object. That kind of thing is hard. We don't have a model for that in rats.
Okay, yeah.
Math ability is another one that is now looks like it might be partially, at least in part influenced by society in terms of social expectations. Stereotype threat is a piece of it, at least. But that's another thing we can't study in rats either is math. Although, potentially there could be it'd be tricky to do. But so I'd say for the development of the brain, right, that's post just after birth. And that's when some things with sex differences in the brain, some of are set up or organized during that early postnatal life. In terms of how that affects cognition, that's another, I wouldn't feel comfortable going to that, I guess, that level. But, it's sex behavior. That's the easiest one to study, right? Male rats will grow up to exhibit male sex behavior, and female rats grow up.
By sex behavior, you mean sexual behavior?
Sexual behavior,
reproductive.
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
Right. So that's one behavior. It's a model to look at sex differences. Is there something going on in the brain that's actually being organized or set up during early life that causes those differences? And we can also manipulate that. Something we do is mess with the system and see what can alter the brain. So this rat still is a male, but no longer has the same level of sex behavior that he used to.
Okay, interesting. And
that's one reason when we know that there's two different surges act at different times to masculinize different systems.
Okay, yeah. And so attraction or desire, I guess like just mating behavior is the correct term.
Right.
Is predisposed and by development. Just that's one of the major, functions of sex differentiation is to cause sex to happen later on down the road. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and then you could maybe see everything else just a side effect of that. I don't know, right?
Yeah,
and then there's some things that again act to decrease as others. So like that there might be a sex difference in social play behavior, but that would be even bigger if there weren't maternal care to dampen it, right? So we don't always, but that's just a theory. I don't know.
Are you? What's your next project, or are you finishing up a project now?
I have a couple. As this summer, I'm actually going to be housing rodents in different conditions. I'm actually kind of trying to look at socialization in rats. This is kind of a little bit off the wall thing. I'm going to house them either with all females, all males, or mixed sex, and actually look at their play behavior. So I'm looking at of
the fraternity, sorority kind of thing.
Right. Well, there's some theories that males. One reason that male rats play more is that there's a social reinforcement of dominance effect. That as they're these male rats that get to be larger in size, they're doing more pinning and more dominant play. That's actually reinforcing the social behavior. So I'm kind of trying to pick that part of it.
Would it be would I be wrong or right or kind of right to say that insofar as one rat dominates another rat, they receive some sort of pleasure from that, and then that causes a reinforcement of that, which produces the higher likelihood that you can repeat that behavior? Right,
potentially. And so we're getting into what the purpose of juvenile play is, which is really a whole nother topic that people are studying, is why do not just rats, but like most mammals play during the juvenile period. And part of it is not to dispute that it's rewarding.
But then there's a question of how does that reward then influence further development, right? And what path that sets you up ongoing.
Because that's probably important for, and some theories are for potential male sex behavior, mating behavior. That's one theory, but potentially cognitive behavior as well. Yeah, so that I'm also going to be looking at cognition across the estrous cycle in the fall, looking at the changes in cognition.
You say every 4 days, that's the length of the cycle?
4 to 5 days, I believe, yeah.
Okay. And how do you know like how big of a difference I guess you're going to study how big of a difference between every point of that cycle.
Yeah, I probably will mostly be categorizing, right? So like estrus phase, luteal phase are the phases
Okay.
of the estrogen cycle. I haven't quite figured out if I'll be able to just track phase, or actually measuring hormones is expensive. Is one
Oh yeah. Okay.
to actually get hormone levels, which would be ideal, right? Is in this group of rats that I have, be able to look at, okay,
Hmm.
what's your estrogen level right now? What's your progesterone level? Because they do vary quite dramatically, those
Okay, they
levels.
do.
Um,
Hmm.
and the other option would be, if because measuring hormones is expensive, is just to know, you can do a vaginal smear and
Hmm.
look at what cell types are present to determine what phase they're in. So you can just say,
Okay.
okay, this rat's in a luteal phase right now, which of course is
Okay.
not as precise then.
Yeah. So that just seems like a big project to extract all that data and do the experiment at the same time, to measure not only the physiological state of the rat, but also the cognitive state of the rat. Is that what you're trying to build a
Right, but
bridge
that's, I mean,
between?
that's the only way to study, that wouldn't actually, still just a correlational study, right? It's correlating. So the other
Okay.
piece would be to actually
Hmm.
remove the ovaries of the rat and give different doses of hormones, which is probably the second piece of that experiment, because that would be a causal experiment of
Oh,
how does
okay.
this level of hormone affect cognition. But you have to do both, right, to have the link. In that case, you'd be able to have causality of this hormone level of progesterone or estrogen, or the combination of the two does this to cognition.
Hmm.
Um,
Wow. Do you have
yeah.
a lot of underlings that help you with these experiments?
Yes, I have two over the summer. They're going to be
Oh,
helping
sweet.
me out, and then during the school year, it's variable. Students here, I mean, as at Evergreen as well, but are busy. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, and that's a big part of the research here, is involving undergrads, and it's one thing that was important to me
Oh,
both.
okay.
Yeah,
Because usually it's the master's level students that are disinvolved with an experiment.
right, which we don't have
Yeah,
master students.
but then
Yeah,
you can draw upon the undergrads.
right, right. And for me, it's undergrad that was an important part of my experience, was doing research.
Hmm.
Um,
Well, cool. Uh, Thanks for joining me.
yeah, thank you for having me.